The story of Katerina Petrova and what the settlers of the Loup River Valley came to call the Petrova folly began in November of 1877. It did not begin with a grand pronouncement or a laying of a cornerstone, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a shovel against limestone. She had arrived with the last wagon train before the first snows, a widow with a 10-year-old son, Mikhail, and 2 crates of possessions that seemed to contain little more than books, strange tools, and bundled herbs. She spoke little English, her words shaped by the hard consonants of the vast, cold lands she had left behind. She claimed a small, unpromising parcel of land 3 miles west of the main settlement, a plot distinguished only by a shallow, south-facing limestone overhang, not deep enough to be a proper cave, but more than a simple indentation. The other settlers, mostly men of German and Irish stock, had built their soddies with grim efficiency, carving thick bricks of prairie earth and stacking them in the low, dark shelters against the coming winter. They were practical structures, proven by a decade of settlement on the plains. They were also cold, damp, and notoriously leaky. But they were the known way, the American way. When Katerina Petrova ignored the prairie sod and instead began to excavate the earth beneath the limestone overhang, the talk began. It started as murmurs in the general store, then blossomed into open speculation, and finally, outright mockery. Jedediah Hale, a carpenter from Ohio who had built half the wooden structures in the county, was the first to give the project its unfortunate name. "Saw the Russian widow today," he announced one afternoon, warming his hands over the pot-bellied stove in the center of the store. "She ain't building a house, she's digging a grave. And that boy of hers, bless his heart, is helping her do it." He gestured with his thumb. "It's a folly, a Petrova folly." The name stuck, solidifying the community's consensus. She was a strange woman, touched by grief or perhaps a simple lack of sense, and her project was a disaster in the making. Captain Alistair Miller, a retired cavalry officer who served as the settlement's unofficial magistrate, felt a sense of duty to intervene. He was a man who believed in order and established procedure. Her methods were neither. "It's a danger, Jedediah," Miller said, his voice low and serious. "She's undermining that rock ledge. A heavy snow, a spring thaw, and the whole thing will come down on their heads. And what about a chimney? You can't vent a fire from a hole in the ground. She'll either freeze or suffocate." He saw it as his responsibility to warn her, to guide her toward the sensible path of building a proper sod house like everyone else. Katerina, however, paid them no mind. Day after day, through the biting winds of late November, she and Mikhail worked. They did not just dig. Their labor was precise, almost surgical. They first cleared a space about 14 feet wide and 20 feet deep under the overhang. Then they began to dig down, not a simple cellar, but a series of interconnected trenches, creating a bizarre sunken labyrinth in the dirt floor. The excavated soil and rock were not discarded, but carefully sorted into piles. The larger stones were set aside, while the clay-rich soil was mixed with water and prairie grass in a shallow pit, trod upon by Mikhail's small boots until it achieved the consistency of thick dough. The source of her strange knowledge was a world away, in a village nestled against the Ural Mountains, where winter was not a season, but a dominant, tyrannical force that ruled the land for 8 months of the year. Her grandfather, a man named Ivan, had been a Pechnik, a master stove builder. He did not build with iron or steel, but with stone, clay, and an understanding of heat that bordered on the mystical. "Fire has 2 lives," he had told her as a small girl, his hands covered in the same gray clay she now worked. "The first is the flame you see. It is loud, hungry, and quick to die. It wishes only to escape to the sky. Any fool can make this fire. He would then tap a massive stone structure that dominated their small home, a structure that served as a bed, a stove, and the very heart of their existence. The second life is the heat you cannot see. It is silent, patient, and lives for a long time. It wishes to stay in the stone. A wise person does not build a house for the flame. They build a house for the heat. This was the core principle of the Pechka, the Russian masonry heater. It was not merely a stove. It was a thermal battery. The American way, as Katerina saw it, was obsessed with the first life of fire. The tall, straight brick chimneys and the simple iron stoves were designed to get the smoke out as quickly as possible. In doing so, they took the heat with them. A straight flue was an open highway for thermal energy to escape. On a cold night, a roaring fire in an American hearth was actively pulling the cold air from every crack and crevice in the house, creating drafts that chilled the very people it was meant to warm. It was a system that demanded constant feeding, consuming enormous quantities of fuel for a temporary, localized bubble of warmth. It was, in her grandfather's words, the work of fools who loved the flame but did not understand the heat. Her design was the opposite. The trenches she dug were the foundation for the cockaloom, the complex system of horizontal flues that would form the guts of her Pechka. She and Mikhail began by lining the trenches with the flat river stones they had gathered. Over this, they laid a second layer, mortaring them with their clay mixture. This created a winding, serpentine channel nearly 40 feet in length that snaked back and forth under the main living area before it would eventually rise to a small chimney stack at the rear of the cave. The fire itself would be small, built in a compact firebox at the front. The physics were simple and elegant. A small, intensely hot fire of fast-burning wood like willow or cottonwood would be lit for only an hour or two each day. The heat and smoke, instead of rushing straight up a chimney, would be forced to travel horizontally through the long, winding stone channel. This slow journey would give the massive stone and earth structure, the floor of her home, time to absorb the vast majority of the thermal energy. The stones would soak up the heat like a sponge soaks up water. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney, it would be cool to the touch, having surrendered its precious energy to the thermal mass of the floor. That stored heat would then radiate slowly and evenly into the living space for the next 24 hours. Over this labyrinth of stone, she constructed the living space itself. Using scavenged lumber and bent willow saplings, she erected a low, arched structure shaped much like the Quonset huts that would become common in a future war. The curved walls, less than 7 feet high at their peak, were not meant to be the primary defense against the cold. The cave itself was the outer wall. The arched frame was an inner shell, creating a dead airspace between her living quarters and the cold limestone of the cave. She sheathed the frame in planks and then meticulously packed the gap with dried moss and prairie grass, creating a layer of insulation several inches thick. The front of the structure, facing out from the cave, was built of thick, mortared sod blocks with only a single small window and a heavy plank door. The final piece was the roof. Here again she defied all local convention. Instead of wood shingles or more sod, she laid heavy planks over the arched frame and covered them with a thick layer of her clay mortar, embedding flat stones into it. Finally, she covered the entire roof with a foot of dry earth from the excavation. Her home was not so much built as it was sculpted from the earth itself. It was a structure within a structure, a warm core protected by layers of insulation, dead air, and the immense thermal mass of the surrounding rock and soil. In mid-December, Captain Miller made his official visit. He rode up to her strange dwelling, his horse snorting in the frigid air. The temperature had not risen above 10 degrees for a week. He saw a low mound of earth with a door in it, tucked under a rock ledge. A thin plume of smoke, barely visible, curled from a short, stubby chimney pipe at the rear. It looked primitive, temporary, and profoundly unsafe. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Mrs. Petrova," he called out, his tone a careful mix of authority and concern. Katerina emerged from the heavy door, wiping her clay-stained hands on her apron. Mikhail peered out from behind her. "Ma'am," Miller began, removing his hat as a sign of respect, "I've come to talk about this situation. The community is concerned for your safety, for the boys' safety." He gestured vaguely at the structure. "This is no way to survive a Nebraska winter. There's still time. Jedediah Hale and some of the men, they're willing to help you put up a proper sod house before the real cold sets in." Katerina listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She understood more English than she let on, and she understood his meaning perfectly. He believed she was a fool, and his charity was born of pity. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her accent thick. "House is strong. House is warm." Miller pressed on, trying to reason with her. He pointed to the short chimney. "Ma'am, that flue is too short. It won't draw, and heat rises. You've built your firebox below your living space. The smoke will have nowhere to go but back into your home. You'll be overcome by fumes in your sleep." He was not being unkind. He was stating what he believed to be indisputable laws of physics and construction. Every man on the prairie knew that a good draft required a tall, straight chimney. Katerina shook her head slowly. She did not argue or raise her voice. She simply stated a different truth. "Heat does not only rise," she said, her gaze steady. "Heat radiates. It moves from warm to cold. The stone holds it." She paused, searching for the right words. "My fire is small, but very hot. Hot air rises fast. It pulls the smoke. Smoke follows pull, not hope." She then pointed to a small stone-plugged hole near the base of the chimney. "For cleaning. All is planned." Her quiet confidence was more unsettling to Miller than any angry outburst would have been. She was not defensive. She was educational. It was as if he, the experienced officer and community leader, was the student being corrected on a fundamental principle. He looked from her calm face to the strange burrow-like home and saw only a tragedy waiting to happen. He was wrong about the chimney. He was wrong about Katerina. His failure to understand what he was seeing would become a defining moment for the entire settlement. He left that day convinced he would be leading a party to retrieve 2 frozen bodies before the spring thaw. The last weeks of December passed, and the cold deepened. The settlers hunkered down in their soddies, the smoke from their chimneys a constant gray stain against the white landscape. They burned through their wood piles at an alarming rate. Inside their homes, the battle against the cold was relentless. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. Water buckets froze solid if left too far from the stove. Life contracted to a small circle of warmth around a constantly hungry fire. Meanwhile, Katerina and Mikhail established a serene and efficient routine. Each morning, Katerina would light a small, quick fire in the Petchka's firebox. For an hour, the fire would roar, consuming a surprisingly small amount of wood. Mikhail would sit on the stone ledge above the firebox, which was always the first part to warm up. After the fire burned down to coals, Katerina would close the iron damper on the firebox and the chimney flue, sealing the heat inside the stone labyrinth beneath their floor. For the rest of the day and through the night, the floor and the massive stone bench that was part of the Pechka radiated a steady, gentle warmth. The temperature inside their small home never dropped below 65 degrees. There were no drafts. The air was still and quiet. The only sound, the distant moan of the wind sweeping over the prairie far above their heads. The portents of the great storm began on January 8, 1878. The sky took on a strange yellowish-gray cast, and a profound stillness fell over the land. The cattle in the settlement's corrals were restless, lowing uneasily and bunching together. An old Pawnee trader passing through told the men at the store that the sky spirits were angry and that a white darkness was coming, one that would last 3 days. They dismissed him as a superstitious old man. The barometer in Captain Miller's office, however, told a more scientific and equally alarming story. It had plummeted lower than he had ever seen. Katerina saw the signs as well. She recognized the color of the sky and the unnatural silence. It was the same stillness that preceded the Buran, the terrible blizzards of her homeland. She and Mikhail spent the day making their final preparations. They brought the last of their cut wood inside, stacking it near the firebox. They double-checked the seals on their door and the small window, packing the gaps with extra moss. They filled every container with water from their well. Then they retreated into their subterranean home, lit their morning fire, and waited. The storm arrived on the afternoon of January 9th. It did not come gradually. It descended like a judgment from an angry God. A low rumble in the northwest grew to a deafening roar within minutes. The temperature, which had been a relatively mild 20 degrees, dropped 40 degrees in a single hour. By sunset, it was 22 below zero, and the wind was gusting to over 50 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that visibility was reduced to zero. It was not merely a storm. It was a physical assault, a suffocating, blinding, killing force that erased the world. For the settlers in their sod houses, the first night was a desperate struggle. Jedediah Hale's home, considered one of the best built in the settlement, became a frozen prison. The wind, with its relentless, searching pressure, found every tiny crack in the walls and around the window frames. It screamed down his tall, efficient chimney, stealing the heat from his fire and driving smoke back into the room. He and his wife Sarah stuffed rags and blankets against the door, but the cold infiltrated everything. The floor was a sheet of ice. The walls radiated a deep, penetrating chill. They had to keep the fire in their cast-iron stove burning at maximum capacity just to keep the center of the room habitable. Jedediah made trip after trip to his woodpile, located just 20 feet from his door. Each trip was a life-threatening ordeal, a blind fight against a hurricane of ice particles that stung his exposed skin and stole his breath. By the morning of the second day, their 2-month-old daughter Eliza had developed a harsh, rattling cough. The cold had settled deep in her tiny chest. Sarah held the baby, wrapped in every blanket they owned, her face a mask of fear. They were losing the battle. 3 miles away, in the Petrova folly, the world was a different place. The roar of the blizzard was a muted, distant hum, the sound of a faraway ocean. The layers of earth, rock, and insulation absorbed the storm's fury, leaving the interior in a state of profound peace. The floor, warmed by the stored heat of the Pechka, was a comforting 68 degrees. Katerina and Mikhail slept soundly through the night on their built-in sleeping platform, which was part of the heated stone mass. They woke, ate a warm breakfast, and Katerina lit her brief morning fire. The small act was calm, routine, efficient. The heat from the previous day had not yet fully dissipated. She was not fighting the cold. She was simply managing a reservoir of warmth. While Jedediah Hale was burning through a week's worth of wood in a single night, Katerina used less than a dozen small logs. She spent the day teaching Mikhail his letters, reading from one of her worn books. The contrast was absolute. One home was a scene of frantic, failing struggle. The other was an oasis of calm, warmth, and security. By the evening of the third day, January 11th, the situation at the Hale cabin was critical. The woodpile was nearly gone. The temperature inside the room, even with the stove glowing red, had dropped into the 40s. Eliza was listless, her breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah looked at her husband, her eyes filled with a terror that finally overrode his pride. "Jedediah," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The Russian woman. You have to go to her." The thought was absurd. Go to the folly, the place he had mocked, the grave she had dug? But then he looked at his daughter, her small face pale and blue-tinged in the flickering lamplight, and he knew there was no other choice. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble, but staying was a certain death sentence for his child. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face, and tied one end of a long rope to his doorknob and the other around his waist. He took a deep breath and plunged into the white maelstrom. The 3 miles to Katerina's homestead were an eternity. He could not see his own feet. He navigated by instinct, by the faint memory of the land's slope, and by sheer, desperate will. The wind tore at him, trying to knock him from his feet and bury him in the drifts. More than once he fell, disappearing into the powder, and had to fight his way back to the surface, gasping for air. He was guided by a single burning image, the thin plume of smoke he had seen rising from her chimney weeks ago. It was a beacon in his mind. When he finally stumbled into the sheltered area beneath the limestone ledge, the sudden drop in the wind's violence was so jarring it almost sent him to his knees. He found the door, a low, dark rectangle in a mound of snow, and hammered on it with his frozen fist. The door swung inward, and the first thing that struck him was not a person, but a wave. It was a wave of warmth, so dense and enveloping it felt like a physical substance. It was a soft, silent, radiant heat that seemed to come from the very floor beneath his feet. It carried the faint, pleasant scent of baked clay and dried herbs. He saw Katerina, her face calm, and then he saw the impossible. Her son, Mikhail, was sitting on the floor in his shirt sleeves, playing with a carved wooden horse. The room was bathed in the steady, gentle light of a single oil lamp. It was a scene of impossible domestic tranquility in the heart of a world-ending storm. "My daughter!" Jedediah gasped, the words tearing from his raw throat. "She is sick! The cold—" He did not have to finish. Katerina's expression shifted from surprise to focused compassion. She nodded once, grabbed a heavy wool blanket from her sleeping platform, and disappeared back into the storm with him, leaving Mikhail to tend the lamp. The journey back was a blur for Jedediah, but Katerina moved with a steady, determined purpose, a small, dark figure against the howling white. They brought Sarah and the baby back to the cave. When Sarah stepped inside, she began to weep, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming shock of the warmth and safety. It was like stepping from a frozen hell into a gentle, sun-warmed garden. Katerina took the baby from her, unwrapped the cold, damp blankets, and laid her on the warmest part of the pechka, the stone bench that served as their seating area. She covered the child with her own dry, warm woolens. For the next 12 hours they stayed there. in the quiet, steady warmth of Katerina's home. The baby's breathing eased. A touch of pink returned to her cheeks. The Pechka, the Petrova folly, had saved her life. The blizzard broke on the fourth day. The wind died, and a brilliant, blinding sun shone on a world transformed, a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts. When the sky cleared, the men of the settlement formed search parties, fearing the worst for those on the outlying homesteads. Captain Miller led the party towards Katerina's land, his heart heavy with dread. He expected to find a tomb. Instead, he found Jedediah Hale, his face haggard but his eyes clear, standing outside the low earthen mound. He was not digging for bodies. He was clearing a path. "Jedediah, you're alive!" Miller exclaimed, relief washing over him. "And the woman? The boy?" Jedediah simply pointed toward the door. "They're fine, Captain. They're all fine." He looked at Miller, and the captain saw in the carpenter's eyes something he had never seen before, a profound and shattering humility. "Captain," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady, "everything I thought I knew about building, about heat, about winter, it was all wrong. You have to see this." Miller and the other men stooped to enter the low dwelling. They were met with the same wave of impossible warmth. They saw Sarah Hale sitting on the stone bench, cradling her sleeping daughter. They saw Katerina Petrova quietly stirring a pot of soup over a small opening in the stone structure. The men stood in stunned silence, their hats in their hands. They looked at the smooth clay walls, the warm stone floor, the peaceful interior. They had survived the storm. Katerina Petrova had lived in it. Jedediah Hale became Katerina's first and most devoted student. He did not ask, he begged. He spent the rest of that winter learning from her, sketching the design of the flue system, learning the proper mixture for the clay mortar, understanding the principles of thermal mass that his own building tradition had completely ignored. He learned the difference between the fire you see and the heat you keep. That spring, the term Petrova folly was never spoken again. It was replaced by a new one, the Petrova stove. Jedediah, under Katerina's supervision, built the first one for Captain Miller. The next year, 3 more families built them. They were labor-intensive, requiring a deep understanding of the principles, but the results were undeniable. Fuel consumption across the settlement dropped by more than half. The brutal winters that had always been a season of grim survival became manageable, even comfortable. The knowledge spread. Settlers from other valleys came to see the Russian widow's house, to learn how she had tamed the winter. Katerina never charged for her knowledge. She taught anyone who was willing to learn, answering their questions with the same quiet, factual patience she had shown Captain Miller. Katerina Petrova lived on that homestead for another 30 years. The 1880 census listed her occupation not as housewife or farmer, but as mason, a testament to the respect she had earned. Her son Mikhail grew up and attended the University of Nebraska, where he submitted a paper on thermal engineering based on his mother's designs, a paper that was quietly archived and forgotten by professors more interested in the new sciences of coal and steam. The knowledge, once so vital, began to fade with the advance of what the world called progress. In 1886, the railroad reached the Loup River Valley, bringing with it cheap coal and mass-produced cast-iron stoves from Chicago. These new stoves were symbols of modernity. They were less work than building a Pechka. They required no specialized knowledge, only the money to buy one, and a steady supply of fuel. The old ways, born of scarcity and deep wisdom, seemed laborious and primitive by comparison. The Petrova stoves fell into disuse, their complex flues clogging with soot. New houses were built with tall brick chimneys, and the old lessons about radiant heat were forgotten. By the time Katerina passed away in 1908, her innovation was already considered a relic, a curious footnote in the valley's pioneer history. The homestead was sold, the cave dwelling abandoned. Over the next century, the entrance slowly collapsed, and the prairie reclaimed the land. The story of the woman who built a house in a cave and survived the great blizzard became a local legend, the technical details blurring with time until it was little more than a ghost story told to children. In 2014, a young couple bought the old Petrova land, intending to build a modern home. While surveying the property, they discovered the limestone overhang and the partially collapsed entrance to the cave. A local historian, hearing of the find, urged them to excavate. Carefully, they cleared away a century of earth and debris. What they found inside stopped them in their tracks. There, in the dim light, was the arched outline of the inner dwelling, and beneath the dirt floor they uncovered the perfectly preserved serpentine channels of the cockaloom, the stone heart of the Pechka. The stones were cold now, but their arrangement spoke of a profound and forgotten intelligence. The principles Katerina Petrova understood were not magic. They were simple, elegant physics, the patient power of thermal mass, the directed flow of energy. She brought not a new technology, but an ancient wisdom that had been tested against centuries of unforgiving winters. She faced a community certain in its own knowledge, and with quiet dignity and unshakable confidence in the lessons of her ancestors, proved them all wrong. She did not just build a warmer house. She taught a generation of settlers a more intelligent way to live, a way of working with nature rather than constantly fighting a losing battle against it. The people are long gone. The memory has faded to myth. But the stones are still there. They remember.